anybody too long today because it's beautiful outside and no one wants to be cooped up inside. So we're going to do a kind of a short lesson, and then we're going to review what we've talked about in the class, have time for questions and discussion, because last week I noticed we had some of that and didn't have enough time. So I want to make sure we have time for that. And if we get done early, go outside, enjoy the sunshine. So we're going to pick up today talking about the time after the exile. And really what this is a lesson on not events that happened after the exile specifically, but what is the enduring impact of the Babylonian exile. And we're going to do that by, that is not, hold up. That's my ending one, not my beginning one. Let's do this. We're going to do it by talking about Daniel, the stories of Daniel. He's going to be our focus today. We've got some classic Veggie Tales in here. If you remember the Daniel in the Lion's Den, or Rack, Shack, and Benny, which was one of my personal favorites. We're going to talk about Daniel. Now, Daniel, we talked about this a little bit last week in the introduction to the prophets. His stories are set during the time of the Babylonian exile. Daniel, the character, exists in Babylon, but it wasn't written likely until probably the 2nd century BC, which is kind of a long time, about 400 years-ish in between when the character of Daniel lived and when these stories were written down, or at least when they were collected, edited, and put out for people to read en masse. And all the narratives focused on 4 young Judeans, Daniel, and then, of course, Rack, Shack, and Benny, who we'll get to later. And they're brought, after being exiled, they're kind of picked by the Babylonian government to serve in the Babylonian leadership. So what they did is they picked Daniel, Rack, Shack, and Benny, and they said, we're going to teach you everything about the Chaldean language and culture. The Chaldean was the dominant cultural group within the Babylonian Empire at the time. They said, we're going to teach you all of it, and then you are going to become leadership. It's probably an important part of controlling of a large swath of land, that you incorporate some from each people into the leadership, because it helps quell some potential for rebellion in that. So Daniel, Rack, Shack, and Benny were picked for that reason. But what we're going to look at today is a couple of the most famous stories, see if we see anything interesting or new in them. And then what we're really going to do is ask this question of why do we wait so long for these stories to be written down? If they happened during the Babylonian exile, why do we wait until the 2nd century? And I think in our answer, we're going to learn a little bit about how the Jewish religion continues to lean on the stories of the exile in their ongoing faith. So, we will start out with Rack, Shack, Benny, and the fiery furnace. Now, we'll start by, I will spoil this for you. Rack, Shack, and Benny aren't their real names. You probably know them as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, which aren't their real names. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are actually their Babylonian names. When they were picked by Babylon and brought into to learn the Chaldean culture, to be completely assimilated into that and the language and all of it, a major part of that was getting a Babylonian name. So Rack, who is Shadrach, his Hebrew name is Hananiah. Shack is Meshach in Babylon, but his Hebrew name is Mishael. And Benny is Abednego, and his Hebrew name is Azariah. At the start of this famous story of the fiery furnace, the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar builds a giant golden statue, or if you're watching the Veggie Tales, a giant chocolate bunny. And he decrees this. He says, "The herald proclaimed aloud, 'You are commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that when you hear the sound of the horn, the pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, drum, and entire musical ensemble, you are to fall down and worship the golden statue that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be thrown into a furnace of blazing fire.' Therefore, as soon as all the peoples heard the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, and drum, and the entire musical ensemble, all the peoples, nations, and languages fell down and worshiped the golden statue that Nebuchadnezzar had set up." And we're just going to keep kind of reading some of these stories today. I've edited them to be a little bit more manageable, but I think it's important to read them. So accordingly, at this time, certain Chaldeans came forward and they denounced the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that everyone who hears the instruments shall fall down and worship the golden statue, and whoever does not fall down and worship shall be thrown into the furnace of blazing fire. There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men pay no heed to you, O king. They do not serve your gods, and they do not worship the golden statue that you have set up." I noticed reading through this, one thing that was interesting, and we'll look for this pattern again later. It's not the king who initially has the issue. It's someone else kind of throws them under the bus, right? Throws the Jewish people under the bus. I thought that was really interesting. So they say this to the king. And then Nebuchadnezzar, in a furious rage, commanded that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought in. So they brought those men before the king. And Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods, and you do not worship the golden statue that I have set up?" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to present a defense to you in this matter. If our king whom we serve is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire and out of your hand, O king, let him deliver us. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods, we will not worship the golden statue that you have set up." Then Nebuchadnezzar was so filled with rage against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that his face was distorted. He ordered the furnace heated up 7 times more than customary, and ordered some of the strongest guards in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the furnace of blazing fire. So the men were bound, still wearing their tunics, their trousers, and their hats, and their other garments, and they were thrown into the furnace of blazing fire. Because the king's command was urgent, and the furnace so overheated, the raging flames killed the men who lifted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But the 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down, bound, into the furnace of blazing fire. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose up quickly. He said to his counselors, "Was it not 3 men that we threw into the fire?" And they answered the king, "True, O king." He replied, "But I see 4 men, unbound, walking in the middle of the fire, and they're not hurt. And the 4th has the appearance of a god." If you look at paintings of this, who do you think that 4th person is? Yeah, we see a lot of paintings, depictions of Jesus in this. It's not said in this story, but it is depicted. Nebuchadnezzar then approached the door of the furnace of blazing fire and said, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here." So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out from the fire. And the satraps, which were Persian governors, the governors of that period, or that area, the prefects, and the governors and the king's counselors gathered together, and they saw that the fire had not had any power over the bodies of those men. The hair on their heads was not singed, their tunics were not scorched, not even the smell of fire came from them. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, and this kind of surprised me, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him. They disobeyed the king's command and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I make a decree. Any people, nation, or language that utters blasphemy against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb and their houses laid in ruins. For there is no other God who is able to deliver in this way." Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. So to recap, 3 men are told to worship the idol, this giant golden statue, but they refuse and trust in their God, even saying, if God wants to save me from death, God will. Otherwise, I still believe I'm making the faithful choice. God does save them in the fiery furnace. And then the Babylonian king, who had just erected a statue of a god, recognizes the power of the Hebrew God over all others. Let's see if we see any more of those themes come back again. In this next most famous story from this, Daniel in the lion's den. Now, there's some interesting stuff that happens between the stories, and this is where the history of Daniel relating to the Babylonian exile is really interesting. So between the story of the fiery furnace and Daniel in the den, King Nebuchadnezzar dies. His son, who's King Belshazzar, takes the throne of Babylon. And then in the chapter right before this story, Persia, it's not explicitly stated, but King Belshazzar is killed. And we know historically the people that did that was Persia when they conquered Babylon. So we see a king or a ruler who's called Darius the Mede, a Persian. And it's interesting because we can't exactly tell what his entire rulership is, Darius. We know that there's an order of Persian kings. There's the first one, the one that conquered Babylon, was Cyrus. And then he had a son, Cyrus II. And then after that, Darius the Mede ruled as king over the Persian Empire. Daniel probably didn't live long enough to serve under the Babylonians and then 3 Persian kings. So we're not entirely sure what's going on historically here, but Darius the Mede is the ruler over at least the province of Babylon during this story, and that's the person who Daniel is serving. Daniel finds favor very quickly with King Darius, and King Darius has this plan where he's got a bunch of governors and then a few, he calls them, I think, are they counselors or something like that, to be the overseers of all the governors. And he wants to promote Daniel above all of them. He wants Daniel to be second in line in the entire, whatever Darius rules, he wants Daniel to be the second, his right-hand man. But there are some jealous rulers who are probably not Jewish, probably from the Persian Empire, that make a plan to stop this from happening because they don't want Daniel in that role. So we'll jump into the story. The administrators and the satraps conspired, and they came to the king and said to him, "O King Darius, live forever." And all the administrators of the kingdom, the prefects and the satraps, the counselors and the governors, all are agreed that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce it an interdict, that whoever prays to any god or human for 30 days, except to you, O king, shall be thrown into the den of lions. Therefore, King Darius signed the document and the interdict. Although Daniel knew that the document had been signed, he continued to go into his house, which had windows in its upper room toward Jerusalem, and to get down on his knees 3 times a day to pray to his God and praise him, just as he had done previously. Then those men watched and found Daniel praying and seeking mercy before his God. Then they approached the king and said concerning the interdict, "O king, did you not sign an interdict that anyone who prays to any god or human within 30 days, except to you, O king, should be thrown into the den of lions? Daniel, one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or to the interdict which you have signed, but he is saying his prayers 3 times a day." Again, he's thrown under the bus, right? By someone who's not the king. It's interesting. When the king heard the charge, he was very much distressed. He was determined to save Daniel, and until the sun went down, he made every effort to rescue him. Then the conspirators came to the king and said, "No, O king, there's a law of the Medes and the Persians that no interdict or ordinance that the king establishes can be changed." They used his words against him, basically. Then the king finally gave the command, and Daniel was brought and thrown into the den of lions. The king said to Daniel, "May your God, whom you faithfully serve, deliver you." And a stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the signet ring of his lords, so that nothing might be changed concerning Daniel. Then the king went to his palace and spent the whole night fasting. No entertainment was brought to him, and sleep fled from him. Then at dawn, the king got up, and at first light hurried to the den of lions. When he came near the den where Daniel was, he cried out anxiously to Daniel, "O Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you faithfully serve, been able to deliver you from the lions?" Daniel then said to the king, "O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths so that they would not hurt me, because I was found blameless before him, and also before you, O king, I have done no wrong." The king was exceedingly glad and commanded that Daniel be taken up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no kind of harm was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. The king gave a command, and those who had maliciously accused Daniel were brought and thrown into the den of lions, they and their children and their wives. Yeah. Before they reached the bottom of the den, the lions overpowered them and broke all their bones in pieces. Brutal. Then King Darius, and this might sound a little familiar, wrote to all peoples and nations of every language throughout the whole world, "May you have abundant prosperity. I make a decree that in all my royal dominion people shall tremble and fear before the God of Daniel, for he is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion has no end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. He has saved Daniel from the power of the lions." So this Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. It's interesting, the similarity of these stories, right? A Jew, is asked to do something that goes against what their law is, what they know God wants. Then they're thrown under the bus, and after a miracle, the king of the conquering empire is praising God. It's really interesting how specific it is. Yeah. Sure, I love it. There's lots of time for it. Yeah, Becky's going to run a mic over to you so we can all hear. She's my runner. Thanks, Becky.
I'm just curious, is this the first time that God is called a living God?
I don't know.
Because I don't recall it being earlier than this. In fact, I don't even recall it being in this book, at least in my Bible, but it's been a while since I read it too. Where did you go? There you go.
I'm not sure about that, and I think yeah. It might be a question of, even trying to answer that might even be a question of dating, of whether you're talking about the location of the narrative or the location of when it was written might be crucial to answering that right too. I don't know. That's a good question. Lori, do you have any ideas on that?
Don't know.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. You have to look that up and let me know. Yeah, read it again. There we go. So let's come back to this question. Oh, we got one more.
Oh,
Yeah.
is this about the same time of Esther, who had kind of a similar situation?
This would be a little before Esther, probably. Probably. Yeah, but it is a good example of, again, we have the Persians that Daniel's working with now. And we know that when Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon, he was the first Persian to do that, first king. So whether Daniel was working with him or however that was going, that he made the edict that the Jews could go home, right? But we said that didn't happen right away. People like Daniel, there are still Jews in the government at this time that are now established. Their livelihood, their careers are part of the land to which they were exiled. So Daniel and his friends are still behind even after the Persians took over, which is interesting. Yeah. So let's see what these stories might have to say about this question. Why wait? If they happen in the 5th or 6th centuries, why aren't they told until the 2nd century BCE? There's a lot of thoughts, but I think the most convincing is about this guy. His name is Antiochus IV Epiphanes, right? We are not naming kids well anymore. That is much better, I think. Much more epic of a name. He was a Greek Hellenistic king who ruled the Seleucid Empire. What happened was the Macedonian Empire that Alexander the Great created through his conquering, eventually, like many empires, was split. After the great leaders die off, new leaders fight, and there's a split. And the Seleucid Empire was one portion of what used to be the Macedonian Empire, but they are very much Greek in culture and in language. And Antiochus IV was very, very focused on the lands that he conquered and ruled over. Hellenization, the converting of all people within the empire to Greek culture and language was his top priority, and he did it brutally. Specifically with the Jews, he wanted to destroy their Jewish religion and their language and replace it with Greek, and he famously burned, or at least ordered burned, all copies of the Jewish law. In Jerusalem, things got even crazier. He's infamous for this. It's called the Abomination of Desolation, where he had offered a burnt sacrifice of a pig, to Zeus, on the temple altar. the most sacrilegious thing, the most insulting, defaming, wrong thing that could be done in the temple. He offered a burnt sacrifice of a pig to the Greek gods. So what might this have to do with those stories we just heard? So we have people 400 years after the exile who are having their law and their religion taken away from them, being forced into a completely different culture, to speak a completely different language, and being demanded to worship other gods. Oh, all of a sudden, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and Daniel in the lion's den, these stories are powerful examples of what you do when you stand firm in your faith and you trust in God to save you no matter what, right? Now, we had conversation last week, which I think this brings up. Are these historical stories? People are asking these all the time. Are these stories something that actually happened and that we just waited to tell? Or is an author in the 2nd century BCE saying these stories are needed right now? And we can use the enduring story, the pain, the learning, everything that we experienced going through exile as a culture. We can use that now to teach us how to respond faithfully in this situation. It's a much bigger 50,000-foot view of what are some fun children's stories, right? Yeah. I think it adds a lot of meaning to them for me. And there's a whole lot more going on. If you take this approach and you read the entirety of Daniel, which we're not going to do because most of it is not related to the exile, but much of it is, especially the end, is apocalyptic literature, very similar, talking about Antiochus, I believe, talking about Antiochus IV, similarly to how the Revelation letter talks about Greek ruler or Roman rulers later. Very, very similar type of literature that goes on there, and with this perspective, you really get a whole idea of what Daniel's getting at. But for us and for our sake today, it makes these stories interesting in, I think, a little bit deeper way than they were, at least to me previously. There's one more story I wanted to tell you, and I told you I would tell this one. This is probably not directly related to any of this, but it's a hero story of Daniel, and it's called Susanna, the story of Susanna. It's not in your Bible, because usually it would be located in Daniel chapter 13. Anyone who's welcome to can try to turn to Daniel 13. You'll only find 12. But if there are certain editions, you can find the NRSV Catholic edition, for example, in the Catholic Church. They do have Daniel chapter 13 in there. Really what this story is, it's a prequel, and I'm going to tell it to you. Rather than read it, it's a bit lengthy. It's its own whole story all in of itself, and probably comes around a little bit later than the original book of Daniel, which is why it's not included in our Bibles. But it's an interesting one nonetheless, and I thought, at least for the entertainment value, I'd like to share it with you. So Susanna is a Hebrew woman who's married to a rich Babylonian man in exile. She's taken as his wife. He's very, very wealthy, and he also seems to be very interested with the Jewish culture, the Hebrew culture, and their teachings and their religion. So at his very large house that he often has gatherings of the Jewish religious leaders and scribes and wise men, smart people. They have meetings and gatherings all the time at his house. And there's a couple of the elders, the Hebrew elders, that come to these meetings regularly, and they notice that every day around the same time, Susanna takes a walk, and they think she's beautiful. They think more than she's beautiful. They begin to lust after her, the story says. And then there's this one day where I think one of the funniest things ever in the Bible happens. They're having one of their meetings, and they go, okay, well, we should go home now, it's lunchtime. So they leave, and then they go their separate ways.
Of Daniel is, right? Yep. And the Catholic Bible is based on the Greek Septuagint, right? Mm-hmm. So the Catholic version of Daniel is bigger and contains stories like Susanna, Bel and the Dragon, the Song of the Three Young Men, and those stories. So yeah. When I teach about the Bible, I've got a chart that shows sort of the lineage of how it all worked out, and why the Catholic Old Testament is bigger than the Protestant Old Testament. But yeah. it has to do with the lineage of the different translations.
Yeah, whereas most of our Protestant Bibles tend to be based on the Masoretic text as opposed to the Greek text. Yes, the Hebrew. Yeah.
Yeah. See.
Yeah.
See, there was sort of a mythology that was built up around the Septuagint.
Yes,
And that
it's a good story.
mythology fell away as the years passed, and by the time of the Reformation, the Reformers decided that what the Protestants should use as their Old Testament should be exactly what the Hebrew Bible was.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. And so when the Jews decided what their Bible should be, they left out a lot of the things that were translated into Greek because, of course, Greek meant nothing to the Jews, right? So the Protestant Old Testament is identical in content to the Hebrew Bible, right?
Yeah.
Different in order, but the same in content.
Yeah. I'd like to share real quick that mythology of the Septuagint, if I may, because it's a very, very interesting story. The story is, and this is probably part of the Hellenization process of getting Jewish religion into the Greek language. The story is the Greeks appointed 70 scribes to interpret 70 as in Septuagint. We have 70 scribes, and they all went into their own little, booths or whatever with the text, and they all interpreted it on their own, and then they all brought it out and said, here's what I've got, and all 70 of them matched perfectly. Which means this is, of course, a divinely ordained translation. It is perfect. It is made this way by God, and that was one of the big tools used to convert Jewish religion into Greek language. I love that story, so I had to tell it. Yeah, it's great. Thank you, Steve. That's really interesting. Yeah, to Tara.
Throughout the whole Old Testament, one of the things I always notice about the stories is there's always a Jewish person, prophet or otherwise, who is advising the king. In all of these stories, they have achieved this very, very important position. Why?
There are a lot of probably potential answers to that.
Is it just because the story needs that, or? Okay. Is it just because the stories that are saved have that person there, or is it that there's a subtle meaning to it or something? Is it that the Jewish people have always valued education, and that promotes them to think broader and be a more critical advisor, or what?
I'd say I'm glad to let Pastor Lori add in on this too. I would say probably two prongs. One being, like you mentioned, we're going to hear about the stories where Jewish people are involved in the Jewish scriptures, so that's probably a big piece of it. And the other is we do know that, especially during the exile, the Jewish schools really, really excelled. Like their wisdom, their scholarship was highly regarded within the Babylonian Empire. So it's not surprising that someone from that school of thought would be seen as a keen advisor. We also do get some evidence, for example, with Daniel, that he wasn't the first pick in Nebuchadnezzar's dreams that Nebuchadnezzar had, but none of the king's normal advisors could interpret the dreams. Eventually, Daniel is picked to give it a shot, and he does it well. And then he repeats that effort throughout the stories in the book. So that's kind of his specific rise. But I think it's probably some sort of a mix in of those three. Lori, do you have something to add to that?
I think there might be these countries that conquer probably know it's in their best interest to keep close to them someone who is understanding and knowledgeable of what's been conquered. It's just a power position, and so it would be helpful to the king to have someone who's really that familiar.
Even just to quell potential rebellions or anything, what's going to make people angry, because you want to rule but not start fights all the time, because that's how empires died. They do make people angry. It's true. None of these empires did well at lasting very long. That is unfortunately true. Persians probably more than most. Any other questions or thoughts about Susanna? That was interesting. And then we'll get into a little bit of a review of the class. All right, if you have more pop up, that's okay. So, what have we learned throughout these 5 weeks together? We learned in week 1 that after dividing, the Israelites and the Judeans, when that became 2 kingdoms, they were each conquered by stronger empires. And then we learned that in the emptiness of the exile, the stories of their people were gathered together and edited. We talked about the documentary hypothesis, the 4 sources that are woven into the Torah. And then also we looked at the critical examination of history and like Samuel and Kings and Joshua and Judges, how Israel or the Judeans in exile looked back and said, here's where we went wrong. Here's how we split off from God. We also learned that prophets led the way through the pain of exile. And I pointed, using Ezekiel primarily, but it's present in all of them, these 3 major theological themes that came out of the time of the exile. One is God has not and will not abandon us. 2, God wants to bring about a new creation. And the third is that a Messiah is coming to lead the way. These are significant theological developments. And then we see today that stories like those in Daniel show us how, whether historical or otherwise, the memory, the cultural experience of the exile had a lasting effect on Jewish culture and religion. And we can see this in other stories too. I heard someone mention Esther. We see this in Esther. We see this in stories like Ruth. We see this in a variety of stories, that the effects of the exile are ongoing. So at the beginning of the class, I made this statement, and I'd love to hear your thoughts or any questions or things that stuck out to you throughout the whole class. But I made this statement that I think the Babylonian exile is one of the most significant events in Christian history, even though the Christians didn't exist yet. And I think that's true because of all this that we've learned, especially those theological themes, which I think are still foundational to Christianity. So I want to know, do you agree? What do you think? We'll go to Lou Ann. She's bringing a mic over to you.
I don't think Christians learned from this.
Oh, interesting.
So you
Tell me
think
more.
about the Babylonian exile, but
Yeah.
Christians have also exiled Jews, the Sephardic Jews from Spain, places in Europe, Hitler. I mean, Christians have exiled Jews
Yeah.
for the last 2,000 years.
Yeah. That's a great point. And we actually see that kind of breakdown happen really quickly after the exile, for the record. In the stories of Ezra and Nehemiah, Ezra comes to lead the way of rebuilding the temple and reestablishing the Jewish religion. And he really kind of goes in on banning intercultural marriage. Anyone who's not Jewish, he prohibits people from marrying them. It's an interesting thing that happens really, really soon after they come back home. And a lot of scholars think that the book of Ruth, the establishment of a foreigner into the line of David, was written post-Ezra as a combat to that way of thinking. So we already do see, just in the first couple generations after they return home, already missing some of the lessons. And I think you're definitely right. We have not learned all the lessons from it yet. Thanks. That's really good. Yeah.
Yeah, and also they didn't always learn their lessons. You mentioned the brutal rule of Antiochus IV Epiphanes.
Yes.
And that was followed by the Maccabean Revolt,
Yes.
right? And they established a Jewish state right after that.
Yep.
But the Jewish state was not a free state, it was a Jewish state, right? So they themselves didn't give the residents there the freedom. It was an enforced Jewish state.
Yeah.
Which is kind of ironic, isn't it?
It is. You're right.
Yeah.
You're right. It's kind of it's just Jewish Hellenization at
Right.
that point is what it
Right,
was.
right.
Just forced conversion to that religion. Yeah. That's a good point. Thanks, Steve. What else? Do you think this is one of the most significant events in Christian history? Yes or no? We got Tara. She's bringing the mic over to you. We got to be able to hear you. It really helps. Thank you.
2 weeks ago or so, or 3 weeks, when Pastor India was preaching about the translations, and she said it was translated as trust in God. And this is about trusting God to follow through on these these commandments or these theological themes, as you want to separate them out.
Yeah.
And the crucifixion was Christ trusting in God that all of that was worth it. So I think it is very important. I think that the theme through all of this, even from the beginning, is trusting in God.
Yeah. That's great. I think that's absolutely right. I've talked with Pastor Laurie about this recently. There's a scholar named Marcus Borg, theologian, and I heard him on a podcast talk about this once. He talked about how the understanding of the word faith has changed so much, especially in modern culture. How it used to be about trust. You don't have to know, you just have to trust. And then it has become, I have to know exactly all of the right things and think all of the right things in order for that to count as faith. But it used to be about just trusting God and acting in accordance with that trust. So I think you're absolutely picking up on a huge theme of faith here. That's what how they would define faith, is as trust. Yeah, Lori.
I think this is significant because if you think of it metaphorically, most of us have some period in our life where we feel exiled. And so I think it is important to Christianity because it ties us back universally to the story of exile and trusting God. That,
Yeah.
God follows through.
God follows through.
And it follows also on the liberation from slavery in Egypt, which is sort of a similar theme. God, you could trust God then too.
Yeah. Yeah, in week 1, near the beginning of this whole class, we watched that video from the Bible Project that those of you who were here saw about exile becoming a metaphor for the ongoing way of life of not just the Jewish people, but of Christians, right? This idea that sometimes we walk through lands, through cultures that don't align with what we believe is the right way to be in the world, and that we are wandering, looking, trying to create that more perfect home, the type of kingdom that God wants to usher in. So that the exile metaphor continues. Yeah. Pilgrim theme. Yeah, totally. Yeah, exile, wanderers, pilgrims, a very, very common theme for that reason. And a lot of this does go back to the imagery of the exile in Babylon.
It seemed to me that when you're talking about these stories again, and there's always that Jewish advisor to the king, but that's also your pilgrim because he stepped aside or he stayed when others went on, or he's went on when others stayed.
Yeah.
Either way, that's kind of the whole missioning thing, bringing Christ to people.
Yeah, or even like the prophets throughout the Old Testament, like what was Elisha lived in the cave, I think wasn't it? Like, I mean, they always were kind of found themselves on the outskirts because the advice that they brought wasn't necessarily popular even with their own people. So that idea of being outside and wandering is very, very common.
Not being popular, but it was still known.
It was still known, yeah.
And so they were still spreading and still growing the church.
Absolutely, that was their job. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know if they would have called it a church yet, but we get that later. But yes, exactly. Yeah. Anything else? Yeah.
There's another reference to the Babylonian captivity also, and that's when the papacy moved from Rome to Avignon. And that's called that.
Yeah, you're right. When the capital of the church moves from Rome to, well, what would it, Avignon, it became Constantinople after that shortly, wasn't it? Was that right? No, maybe I'm incorrect. It moved a couple times. But I've never thought about that as a connection to the Babylonian captivity. Is it really? I didn't know that. That's interesting. So you're saying that they, with hindsight, look back on that move within the church history and relate it to the change. Oh, that's interesting. Relate it to the exile. They look at the change and say that's like the exile. Because it moved to the east. That's. Avignon, France. This is much later than I was thinking. I was thinking much earlier, the first time it moved. Okay, I was thinking about the first time it moved. I wonder if they did that then too, because they did move the capital east. Yeah, under Constantine. Yeah, Constantine. Yeah. That's very interesting. I love that. Thanks for bringing that up. That's very interesting. It continues to be an enduring metaphor. Any other questions or something that just stuck out to you during the course of the class or in our debrief of it? Yeah, I want to mic over to Fran there.
It's a little off the subject, but in recent years, there was some rebels who captured all the girls in a school, and they made them, I don't know, pledge allegiance or forget God or something they had to say. And all the girls got freed by doing that, except for one who did not and was kept. I don't remember if anybody else remembers where that was.
Yeah. I remember growing up with like fear stories like that. I've heard similar stories, but I remember, was it a school shooting? Was it Columbine, wasn't it? Yeah, I think it was Columbine, where they asked people to renounce God before killing them. I remember hearing that story as a kid and being asked, like, would you do it? Would you do it? I remember that distinctly as like a youth, wondering through that question. Huh? Peter did. Yeah. I guess I'd be in good company if I messed it up. Yeah, that's really interesting. Thanks, Fran. Anything else before we enjoy the sunshine? No, go for it. We got it. We got it. Let's do it.
The Tower of Babel,
Yeah.
Shinar. How do you feel about that story? Is that a story? Is that a myth? Just explain how come.
About
we
the
all
Tower of Babel?
Yeah, how come we all speak different languages? Why is that in there?
I definitely view it as more of a myth. And I do think that with the knowledge of the history and where those stories were written down, which was in Babylon, in exile, I think the video the first week talks about this connection even a little bit, that it's after they're kicked out of the Garden of Eden. One of their first stops is Babel, where they're working on building the tower, right? Well, that sounds kind of similar to being pulled out of Jerusalem, out of Judah, and taken into Babylon. Doesn't mean it's not true, but I think that doesn't mean it's not historical, but I think there's probably a deeper truth the author's trying to point to with that story. Yeah. That's a good question, though. That's an interesting story, too. Very short and talked about a lot, too. Very interesting. Anything else? Yeah, when we're back over here. Oh, thank you. I'm so glad you enjoyed the class. Thank you. Thank you all. I have really enjoyed being up here and doing this. It's a different kind of prep. It's a different kind of teaching than I'm used to, and I've loved it. And I'm very excited to get back down with my high schoolers. So after Easter, I'm excited to get back into it with them too. So thank you all. Thanks everyone for coming to this. I really appreciate you.